Recipe Scholars, Miss Jacoby here. Today for our masterclass video, I'm going to teach you how to make mall-style soft pretzels. And we're going to go through two different ways that you can make them, either sweet or salty. So let's go ahead and jump right into what our ingredients and tools are for this recipe. All right, so ingredients that you need for this recipe are butter, yeast, sugar, flour. I'm using all-purpose flour, but this also works with self-rising flour, or you could use wheat flour if you wanted to as well. And then you're also going to need salt or cinnamon, depending on if you want to make sweet or salty ones. I'm going to make a mixture of both. And then for tools, you're going to need a measuring cup, some kind of brush, or you could just use a spoon, a whisk, a bowl that can be made out of any material. And then you're also going to need a bowl that's either glass or plastic. And I'm going to go through why you need a non-metal bowl here in just a second. And then the last thing you're going to need is hot water for your ingredients. And then you also need access to your oven and to a baking sheet. All right, so before we get started, I just want to go over a few safety precautions before we dive into our recipe. The first thing is there's two different ways that you can go about making this recipe. One is with an end product that looks almost exactly like how a mall-style pretzel looks, where it's really dark on the outside, but still super soft and fluffy on the inside. The second way is to make the pretzel where it's not dark on the outside, still super soft and fluffy on the inside. Both ways taste the exact same. So the reason I'm giving you both ways is because depending on if you want to make it look exactly like a mall-style pretzel, then we have to do something called a lye soak. Now, the way the pretzels have been made throughout history is after you make your dough and you shape it into the shape that you want, you put it into boiling water with a chemical in that water called lye, L-Y-E. Now, lye is really toxic. It's also really hard to find in a grocery store nowadays. So we're gonna make a homemade version of lye to get the same effect. Now, this version is not as dangerous as the lye version, but it still is a skin irritant and it can really hurt your eyes or your lungs if you breathe it in. So there's two different ways we can go about making this. One way where we're using our homemade lye, which is just going to be done using baking soda, or without using that homemade baking soda solution. All right, so it's up to you. Regardless of which way you decide to make your pretzels, I strongly recommend that you watch the video all the way through so that you have an idea of how each way will turn out and how each way will work. And you also need to make sure, no matter if you're an elementary Odyssey student or if you're a high school Odyssey student, that your parent knows that you're going to be making this in your kitchen. All right? So make sure you have parent permission. Watch the video all the way through so that you can decide which way is the right way to make it for you. All right, so if you're gonna go the route of making your mall-style pretzels have a really dark outside coating, what we need to do is take baking soda and we need to put it into a 250-degree oven for an hour. Now that sounds like a long time, but you're gonna be making your dough and letting your dough rise during this time anyway. So regardless of if you wanna do the baking soda soak for that dark outside color or not, the time will still be the same. So if you are going to do the baking soda dark outside color, what you're going to need is your baking sheet. This is the same sheet that you're going to use to actually bake your pretzels on. And then you also need parchment paper. Parchment paper is not the same thing as wax paper, so you want to make sure that it says parchment paper. All right? Parchment paper comes in a lot of different types of packages, so yours might very well look different than mine. But make sure that it's parchment paper and not wax paper. If your parchment paper comes on a roll, a neat little kitchen trick you can do to make it stay flat on your sheet is to take the parchment paper and actually crinkle it up. Like how you would throw out a piece of paper, and then uncrinkle it. And when you do that, it'll lay a lot flatter on your baking sheet. Like that. All right, so you're gonna take about 2/3 of a cup of baking soda. We're using baking soda, not baking powder. And you're gonna sprinkle this on top of your parchment paper. You want to try and get this in as even of a layer as possible. All right, again, this is about 2/3 of a cup. This is actually the last bit of my baking soda that I have at home, so I'm going to be a little bit short of 2/3 of a cup, but that's okay. All right, so 2/3 of a cup of baking soda, evenly placed on your baking sheet. Do your best to make sure it's not touching the metal part of your baking sheet. All right, it's not going to cause any crazy chemical craziness. It's just not going to get as strong as we want it to be. So we want to make sure we're keeping it on the parchment paper, not on the metal. All right, so now that we've shaken out our baking soda onto our cookie sheet, we're going to put it in a 250-degree oven for 1 hour. So I'm going to go ahead and set our timer for 1 hour. All right. So while that's going, let's go ahead and get our dough. To make our dough, the first step you want to do is put 1 cup of warm water into a bowl. This is the bowl that doesn't matter what it's made out of. I'm using a metal bowl. Now, for those of you who want to be really precise, you can use a temperature thermometer. You don't have to use this, but yeast can sometimes be a little bit finicky, so checking the temperature of your water can be really helpful. Now, warm water means something different to everyone. So for yeast to bloom, which is where yeast gets all foamy and soapy looking, you need to be between 110 and 115 degrees Fahrenheit. That is almost uncomfortable to touch, all right? It should kind of feel like a warm shower, all right? So I have instant yeast. You can also use active dry yeast, or if you're not able to find yeast in a grocery store right now, you can also make your own yeast at home. If you need to make your own yeast, you're going to want to start making your own yeast between 3 and 5 days before you need it for this recipe. You can make an unlimited amount of your own at-home yeast, and all you need to make at-home yeast is flour and water. If you Google sourdough starter, it'll show you how to make your own homemade yeast. Super easy. I've done it before. It works out just the same as yeast that you purchase at the store. All right, so if you have packet yeast, you're gonna just shake this yeast on top of your water. But before we do that, we need to add some sugar. So yeast is living, which seems kind of crazy, but it's living bacteria that make our bread products have lots of nice bubbles on the inside, and it has to eat something in order to be able to activate. So we're gonna get 2 tablespoons of white sugar, and we're gonna drop it into our warm water. All right, and then we're gonna use our whisk to stir this around until the sugar is dissolved. So you wanna stir this around until the water looks basically clear again. And it shouldn't take too long. All right, so our water looks clear. We're now gonna take our yeast and we're gonna just sprinkle it on the top of our water. And it's gonna make kind of like a coating on the top. And we're gonna leave it to sit for 5 minutes. And when we come back in 5 minutes, we're gonna look and see what it looks like. It should look extra foamy and soapy looking. All right, so it's been about 5 minutes and our yeast has bloomed. If you look real closely, and I'll pick this up so you can kind of see it, our yeast is all kind of soapy and foamy looking on the top of our water. So that's what you want it to look like. Depending on how long you've had your yeast for, if it's been maybe in your pantry for a little bit, this process could take a little bit longer, maybe closer to 10 minutes. The time really doesn't matter. It should be between 5 and 10 minutes, as long as you're starting to get that kind of foam on the top. All right, so to this mixture, we are going to add 2 tablespoons of melted butter, and I just melted mine in the microwave. 2 tablespoons of melted butter. And then we're also gonna add in a little bit of salt. Now, it doesn't matter if you are making the sweet version with cinnamon sugar or the salty version, we still need to put some salt into our dough. So we're gonna put in about a teaspoon of salt, and I'm just using kosher salt, the same salt that I'll use to put on top of my salty pretzels. So that goes in, and then we're gonna start adding our flour. Depending on the type of flour that you're using, you'll use between 2.5 to 3 cups of flour in total. I am using a 1/2 cup measuring cup so that I can add it in a 1/2 cup at a time. I'm gonna be mixing this using my hands. My hands are freshly washed, and I recommend that you use your hands as well. 1, because it's fun, but 2, because it gives you a really good feel for how your dough is coming together. All right, so I'm gonna start off with 1 full cup. So I'm gonna go, here's a 1/2 cup, and I'm gonna go ahead and right on top of that add another 1/2 cup. So I'm starting with 1 cup of flour. All right, I'm gonna set my measuring cup down, and then we'll go ahead and just start stirring this together. Again, it's gonna feel kind of weird, but you get a really good feel for how your dough comes together when you stir it by hand. Make sure as you're mixing this that you're scraping the bottom of the bowl as well as the sides to make sure that everything gets incorporated nice and evenly. All right, now this is still a little bit too wet. So if you look, see how this is kind of like stringy almost? That's telling me that it's too wet still. All right, so we're gonna add another 1/4 cup. I'm just gonna shake it in all over, and then we'll incorporate it in. All right, so you can kind of see why we want to be doing this with our hands, because if you do this in a stand mixer or with a hand mixer, you're not really going to be able to feel if your dough is ready or not. All right, now if you do this correctly, eventually, as you're mixing this, the dough will come off your fingers and you'll have a nice ball of dough. I think we're getting right about there. So you can see our dough is really starting to come together in a ball. It's not as sticky on my hands anymore. It's pulling away from my fingers. And that tells us that we're right about where we need to be. So you just kind of want to fold the dough over on itself a few times. Just make sure it doesn't feel too wet. And that feels about right. So what we're going to do now is we're going to take our dough ball and we're going to set it to the side real quick on a piece of plastic wrap so that we can clear our bowl out. All right, so now that our dough ball has formed and we've cleaned out our bowl, what we're going to do is take a little bit of flour and we're just going to spread it on our work surface. If you have kitchen countertops that have grout in them, like if they're tile and it's got grout lines in it, then you're going to want to do this on top of a chopping block. My countertops are flat, so I'm just going to straight use my counter. All right, so sprinkle a little bit of flour on top. Keep your flour canister near you just in case you need some extra, and then you're going to grab your dough ball. All right, so what we're going to do now is knead our dough. And what kneading does is it breaks up the gluten and it makes our dough nice and soft. So take a little bit more extra flour, sprinkle it on top, and then the way that you knead is you kind of fold the dough over and then press it down with the heel of your hand. Fold, press, over and over again. And you want to do this until your dough feels really soft. All right, we're doing this with clean hands on a clean surface. That way we make sure our dough is nice and yummy. So you're going to knead your dough for maybe 3 to 5 minutes. So once you've gotten your dough nice and kneaded, you're going to kind of roll it around to get it into the shape of a ball. You can also do that by picking it up, kind of just shaping it around in your hands, just like that. And you know that this is ready because when you press down on it, it doesn't necessarily bounce back. That's how you know that you're ready and you've kneaded it enough. So we're going to use the same bowl that we made our dough in. I've just lightly greased it with some cooking spray. You can also use either olive oil or canola oil. And just kind of put a little bit in your hands and wipe it around the bowl. And you're going to place your dough ball inside of your bowl. Just kind of roll it around so it gets nice and oily so it doesn't stick to your bowl. And then you're going to place a dishcloth over your bowl. And you're going to let this sit and rise for between 45 minutes to an hour. All right, so our baking soda is done baking in the oven and we've let our dough rise. If you look, it's gotten a lot bigger than it was when we first put it in, which is awesome. It smells so yummy. So here is where we are going to go ahead and shape our dough. So to shape our dough, all you need is a flat surface and something to cut it with. So I'm going to be using a butter knife, and I'm also going to be using just my countertop. But again, if your countertop is textured, or if your counter is made out of tile and it has grout lines on it, then you're going to want to use a cutting board. So let's go ahead and turn the dough out and I'll show you how to cut it and shape your pretzels. All right, so to shape our pretzel dough, the first thing we're going to want to do is take some oil. You can use Pam spray or canola oil or vegetable oil, any kind of oil that you have in your pantry. You're just gonna put a little bit in your hand, just a tiny bit, and just kind of coat your palms so that your palms are greased up. All right, you don't have anything down on your surface, you're just greasing your hands. And what you're gonna do is you're gonna turn your dough out onto the countertop. All right, here is the dough that we made, and you can see that it's gotten nice and airy. Now what we don't want to do is knock out any of that air. So you don't want to roll this out, you don't want to press it down. All right, you're going to take a knife, I'm just using a butter knife, and you want to separate this into 6 equal sized pieces. So the way that I like to do that is we kind of have basically a circle. I'm going to just press and cut it in half. And again, it's not going to be, doesn't have to be exactly 6 equal pieces, which you want to get as equal as possible because those are going to create your 6 pretzels. All right, so you just want to get as close as possible. Again, it doesn't have to be exact, but kind of close. All right, so we have our 6 pieces of dough. So what you're going to do is start out with one of your pieces. I'm just going to move these out of the way. And on your counter space, you want to roll these out into really long ropes. So you're just going to use the palm of your hands to do this. Again, you greased up your hands. You're going to start in the center of the dough, kind of press down a little bit, and while you're pressing down, kind of move back and forth. Now you're going to notice some parts get fatter than other parts. You can just focus on those parts to stretch them out. But you want to end up with a nice even rope. You want your rope to be pretty long, about 3-ish feet, because we're making full-sized mall style pretzels. All right, it's okay if the dough tears a little bit. Just try and press those parts back together. If it's tearing, that's kind of telling you you're pushing a little too hard, so just kind of lighten up a little bit. All right, so here's our rope of dough. Now, to shape our pretzels, you want to put it into a U shape like this, and then you want to cross the 2 pieces over like that, and then you're going to bring them down and touch them to the bottom. And when you do that, you get a pretzel shape, just like that. Now, as I form these pretzels, I'm just going to set them onto a sheet of parchment paper so they don't stick, and we'll continue on making all of our pretzels. All right, so we have 6 formed pretzels now. You can bake these as they are right now and they will still taste amazing. But if you want that classic pretzel dark brown outside, then there's one more step we need to do before we butter and salt them and put them in the oven. And I'm gonna go ahead and show you that process right now. All right, so if you want to make your pretzels have a very dark brown outside, these are the steps that you're gonna follow before we bake our dough. In a glass or plastic bowl, not metal, you wanna add in hot water. Now I got this hot water from the tap in my sink. The tap in my sink gets really hot if I turn it all the way to hot, so this is the water that I'm gonna use. If your tap water doesn't get super hot, you could heat it on the stove. It should be almost too comfortable to touch. This water is quite hot. It's not water that I'd put my hand all the way in because it is quite warm. And then here we have our baking soda that we baked for an hour in the oven at 250 degrees. Now, here's the deal with this baking soda. This is still baking soda, but we have made how strong it is be stronger because we baked it in the oven. So we made this baking soda a lot stronger than it is when it just comes out of the box. And this will create a solution when we mix it in the water to make the dough a lot darker when it's baked. This solution, or this baking soda, when you dump it into the water and then stir it around, it's going to be very important that you don't breathe in the baking soda when you add it to the water. This baking soda, again, it's very strong, just don't breathe it in. You can either use tongs when you're dipping, which I'll show you in just a moment, or you can use your fingers. I'm going to be using my fingers, and then just wash your hands when you're done. Don't touch your face or your eyes or your mouth after you do this. So the easiest way to do this is to pick up the sides of your parchment paper and then carefully come over to your water and dump it into the water. Dump it away from your face. Get it all into the water. All right, and then we're gonna put this parchment paper into the trash. All right, so now you're gonna use a whisk to whisk this baking soda in until the water is almost clear. Now, it's very much not clear right now. It's gonna take a while for you to mix this until it's clear, but go ahead and do that until your water is nearly clear. All right, so I've whisked this. You can see there are some chunks of baking soda in the bottom. That's totally fine. We're really just gonna be working with the top of the water anyway. So if you have a little bit of chunks in the bottom like I do, that's fine, but you should be able to see through the bottom of your bowl if your bowl is glass, or you should be able to see the bottom of your bowl if you're using a plastic bowl. Again, we don't wanna use a metal bowl, not because it'll create a bad reaction, but because it will basically ruin what we just did in the oven with the baking soda. All right, so if you are going to use this solution, the best way to do this is to have your baking sheet on one side and your solution on the other with your dough, your folded up pretzel shapes, and we're just going to go from dough to water to pan. Now we do need to add some parchment paper onto our pan. So because I've already used parchment paper for these pretzels, what I'm gonna do is just drag the dough onto the baking sheet. That way we're not wasting parchment paper. But you can cut yourself another sheet if you want. So here's what you do. And again, if you don't use the solution, you just bake them straight like this. You would sprinkle some salt on, like you'll see us do in a moment. For your salty ones, if you're just gonna make cinnamon sugar ones, then don't sprinkle on salt. You'll just bake them straight like this. But I'm gonna show you what they'll look like if you do the baking soda solution. So what you do is you pick up your dough, you make sure that your two pieces that were twists are securely attached to the bottom part, so you can kind of just like pinch them together. And then you're gonna drop this dough into the hot water, all right? And you're gonna let it float there for about 15 seconds on that side, and you're gonna turn it over. All right, so we're gonna flip it over. Ooh, this water's hot. All right, and that's it. And then we're gonna pull it out and set it back on the baking tray. Now, this is gonna feel kind of slippery. Make sure that you are not touching your face with your fingers right now. Don't touch anything else with your fingers. If you feel more comfortable using 2 pairs of tongs, that's totally fine. Because I've made this recipe a few times, I am just gonna use my fingers. But again, you can use tongs to do this as well. So we're gonna dip all of these and then continue on with our recipe. All right, so all of our pretzels have been dipped, and I just finished washing my hands with soap and water. Make sure that you wash with soap and water and rinse until your fingers don't feel slippery anymore. All right, so here's what they look like after they're dipped. They don't really look any different, but I promise when you put them in the oven, they will look very different. So I am gonna make 3 salted pretzels and 3 cinnamon sugar pretzels. So what I'm gonna do is grab some salt. You could use table salt for this, but really coarse kosher salt is the way to go. That's what pretzel salt is in the mall. And you're just gonna shake this right on top of the pretzels that you want to be salty ones. If you're only making cinnamon sugar pretzels, then you do not wanna do this part. All right, so now that we've salted our 3 salt pretzels, we're leaving the other 3 plain because we're gonna put cinnamon sugar on those. We're gonna put our tray into a 450-degree oven for 8 minutes, and you're gonna turn your tray 180 degrees 4 minutes into your bake time. So 450 degrees, 4 minutes, flip the tray, another 4 minutes, and then they're done, and we'll get to top them with butter and yumminess. So into the oven we go. All right, our pretzels are ready. Let's go ahead and pull them out and see how they look. Oh, look at that. All right, so here are our pretzels fresh out of the oven. You can see how dark they got in a very quick amount of time. That's because of that baking soda water solution we dipped them in before we put them in the oven. If you don't use that baking soda water solution, they are gonna be like this lighter color that you can kind of see on the edges. That's totally fine. It doesn't affect the taste at all. So we have the rest of our melted butter. This is the rest of the stick that we had melted when we first made our dough. And you can either use a brush, or if you don't have a brush, you can just use a spoon. And what we're gonna do is coat all 6 of these in melted butter. Nice and yummy. This is definitely not a low calorie or diet snack food. All right, so the salt ones are done. These are ready to be eaten right now. If you want to do cinnamon sugar ones, what you're gonna do is in either a shallow bowl, or I have here a disposable pie tin, you're gonna wanna combine cinnamon and sugar. So the ratio that I like to use is a 1/2 cup of sugar to 2 tablespoons of cinnamon. That gives you still a really good cinnamon flavor, but it's not bitter. So to make cinnamon sugar pretzels, you're gonna have your cinnamon sugar combined in a very wide mouth container. So again, I'm using a throwaway pie dish. You could use a plate if it has like kind of an edge on it, or a very wide bowl. And the way that you're gonna do this, you wanna do this one at a time so that the butter doesn't dry. So on a non-salted pretzel, you're gonna coat it in melted butter. And the only place that the cinnamon sugar will stick is where the melted butter is. So make sure that you get it covered. And then using a pair of tongs or your fingers, it's up to you, but these get quite hot, you're gonna place it face down into your cinnamon sugar, like that. And then you kind of shake it around. All right, get her all coated. And then there is your cinnamon sugar pretzel. Yummy. All right, so let's get all these guys coated and back on our tray and see how they look at the end. All right, well, here is our finished product. They look so yummy. They smell so good. I hope that you guys enjoyed learning how to make these, and if you make them, I hope that you share them with your family and your friends, and let me know how the recipe went. All right, y'all have a great rest of your day. See you next time we bake.